So if your tank is running low at the end of the year and you would like to listen to some fucked up, shitty rock music that doesn't rock and is barely music, I've got 21 noise rock records to talk about. It's not really a best of list. This is just like a mixture of post punk, noise rock, and post hardcore that all kind of fits under the same umbrella. That these are just records that I wanted to review, that I wanted to talk about throughout the year, that I set aside for this list. So there'll be a couple of great albums here. There'll be a couple of terrible albums here, but overall, this should be interesting to folks who like noise rock in general, but also variants that reach into post punk and post hardcore just as much. Of course, we start out with a post-punk band, and one that is on the verge of noise rock just as much as they are, maybe a little bit of post-hardcore here and there, with Stuck's Freak Frequency. Now, this is definitely a band that is tuneful from the start. I think a lot of bands out of Chicago realize that they need to write songs to get noticed, and Stuck are a band that writes songs, and that's what's important to me. They're certainly a post-punk band in terms of writing these tuneful, stabbing sort of pieces without going full-on like Gang of Four with them. That is sort of the realm that I see their music coming from in general, and for me, every song is just it's not necessarily a hit, but it hits. It's a quick, catchy, but probably pretty depressing piece that it's a solid record overall. I bought most of their material to date, and this is some of their best work to date, although I liked a couple of the songs on their last tape a little bit more. Bug is an Innsbruck, Austria-based noise rock band who've been around for quite some time. This is their ninth record, and Lux Ultima is still touching upon a little bit of art rock, a little bit of sludginess. It's an aggressive, compacted form of freak out rock music, which is kind of shouting, kind of strange. It has its own, a lot of noise rock focuses on one vocal type and one register and sort of rants and screams and shares their frustration with the world under one voice. And this is very much that type of band. They do write several different types of songs. They've developed this oeuvre over the course of many, many years. But really, they haven't fundamentally changed in drastic ways since the late 90s. And I would say that this is one of their more straightforward records in some respects in terms of returning to their sort of sludgy, repetition heavy noise rock songs and veering less often into bits of jazz and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say this is an amazing record. It's just a pretty sharp record that might convince you to check out their other work and see where they've been. They've had more experimental records, which might be more interesting. This is maybe one that just has more to say, and the stuff they have to say makes a lot of sense. It's a very nihilistic record. It's a very realistic record, and a fucked up one too. So, uh, maybe sometimes what a band has to say can help make their music more appealing because it is noise rock, and they make an awful racket. Day Job is a Birmingham, Alabama-based noise rock group, and one that is probably more on the level of what people recognize as noise rock today, which is something that's heavily influenced by bands like Unsane, where they are bass heavy, the production has a certain atmosphere to it. It's quite an angry record and a frustrated record, which is about digging a hole, and it's certainly more about more than that. But you can figure the obvious socio political meanings that would come from somebody who's got a hole to dig endlessly. Um, Otherwise, this is a very strong and heavy record, a very frustrated, screaming one that doesn't really veer too much into the mathcore area. It sticks with the a pretty standard, straightforward form the post-hardcore influenced noise rock, which you would want from Hex Records. They're a pretty consistent label, and most anything they released in the last, I don't know, 5-10 years is pretty solid. So this is not an exception. It's a very strong record, and a pretty safe bet if you're going to go pick up something that's more recognizable as noise rock today. Baltimore, Maryland-based quartet Mastier are a little bit more mathematical in their movements. They use dissonant chords and maybe a little bit more of a post-hardcore and mathcore touched feeling to some of their sounds, and they're a little bit more buried in the mix overall, and they obscure their movements in a way that is not so much classic noise rock as it is influenced by sludgier stuff that's more modern, but also a little more technical and angular in its movements. And that's kind of a million different ways to say that there are skronking and dissonant guitar techniques here that dominate this very aggressive style of noise rock, I would say. Probably more for people who are interested in the more aggressive side of post-hardcore as well. Mr. Fliz is another Chicago-based band, and one that focuses on a more unique kind of take on what noise rock is. It's kind of their own thing. It has a lot more to do with the alternative rock side of thing. There's a little bit of like a desert rock feeling to the vocalist. There's a little bit of a more funkier freak out to the rhythms in this duo. They're not necessarily making comedy rock, but they do have a very strong spiky personality here, which is kind of having fun, but also is pretty dire at the same time. And it's a pretty short, exacting record. This sounds probably 10 times better than any of their other recordings. They mentioned they used quality gear on this recording, which, whatever that's supposed to mean. It's a better sounding record overall. And for me, what's lacking from their stuff is really just a more of a bass guitar presence, and that's about it. I think it's a solid record, and I ended up coming back to it more times than I thought. So check it out. The crowd when there's nobody listening. In the crowd in Sluta Burkning is a mix of noise rock, jazz, and punk, and kind of a punk jazz record overall, but also one that incorporates some more noisome experiments and psychedelia in the way that they move about. It is much more of an art rock record, I would say, but one that fits in with noise punk and that kind of thing as well. Now this kind of made me think of like No Means No and that kind of thing. It's not exactly that. Their template for noise rock is something different, probably something a little bit more classic than that even, and more of a touch and go type of thing. So overall, this is a pretty experimental record. It goes all over the place. It's telling kind of an interesting story, and there's a lot to take in. You probably want to either know some Swedish or be prepared to translate it to really get the full heft of what they're talking about and why it's a pretty cool record overall. But if you just, jazz, punk, and noise rock mixed together, is a pretty interesting time no matter what. And this was kind of one of my more favored records that I pulled from for this list. There's sort of a laissez-faire sort of attitude attached to Love Ethics, the Thinking Man's Redux. As far as I understand, they sort of re-recorded a bunch of songs they'd already put together, and I don't know anything about this band really, but there's a mix of noise rock and alternative rock on this record, and some of it is punk and melodic and pushed around, and other parts are maybe something closer to a post-hardcore band. And so there's sort of a grind to some of it, and a free movement to the rest of it. And some of it goes a little bit too far into the alternative rock territory, and some of it doesn't go far enough. It's kind of a mixed bag of a record. Most of it is what I would describe as tuneful, where you get, if I could imagine myself listening to this live, I would get the song from the performance, and that's, halfway getting there in terms of rock music. I don't know that there's anything that stands out about this in terms of style. I think the album art is terrible, and the production is just all right. But they're obviously they have a knack here on this album. They're still developing, which shines through ultimately.
With shame, I am ashamed.
Now, I guess from my point of view, when we talk about art rock and noise rock and things like that, this Alpha Strategy EP, which is fairly short at about 12 minutes, is closer to what I consider maybe the peak of noise rock in maybe the late 80s, something that is more about making guitar noise and bringing a voice to guitar noises, and something that is ultimately supposed to be weird and anti-rock, something different from what the 70s had pushed into the 80s, and something more out of line. And that's all well and good, but this is not a tuneful record necessarily. It's one that produces a lot of interesting noises, and is always leading somewhere without knowing where it's going. And so I appreciated that most people compare their sound to the Birthday Party, I think, because of the unique way that the main person behind the band, Rory Hinchy, vocalizes. But his guitar work is far more interesting than his vocals overall, and I think some of it is kind of terrible in that regard, but in the way that noise rock is supposed to be. I call it audio terrorism for a reason. Is because noise rock is supposed to be a certain avant-garde by nature sort of thing, rather than a category. So I appreciate that about it, but I know this is probably not accessible for most people. For their third full-length album, Bologna, Italy-based noise rock duo Nadsat have switched over from an instrumental sort of post-hardcore band into something more distinctly 90s noise rock influenced, and I would say probably a little bit of on the heavier side, probably idealizing something like earlier Helmet in some respects, and less of the sort of jazzcore and mathcore that was feeding into their earlier releases. So they've got a vocalist, and he's actually he brings a more metallic, shouted, rough vocal here, and so this leads this down for maybe a hairier path than a lot of people will want. It's very aggressive. It's more metallic, and less so the late 80s, early 90s noise rock sound as so much as it is maybe edging towards the middle of the 90s with sort of what I call aggro rock, the stuff influenced by earlier Helmet, the non-melodic stuff. So this is still worth checking out. It's not a bad album. I think it's kind of their start in this direction, so it'll be interesting to see where they take it over time. Void is the second half of a diptych of albums from Vancouver, Canada's Ken Mode, a sort of sludge metal and avant-garde noise rock band who have expanded their lineup in the most recent years, and their sound has sort of flourished because of it. And on this record, it's the second half to another one which was more contemplative, frustrated. It had a couple of kind of burner songs that were faster and showed better as singles. And this record just gets into it a little bit more. It's much more aggressive. It's got slower songs, but better songs in that sort of industrial influenced edge that the previous record had. overall, this is one of my favorite like noise rock related records of the year. I think not because it's accessible, because it really is not one of their more accessible records overall, but because it is heavier. It's just a better, more involved record than the one that came before it, and I was glad to see that change complete the duo of albums. So we can just get to this heavy side of the band, and for me, that was more interesting than a lot of the kind of fumbling and goofy stuff that we usually get from the subgenre. So, pretty standout band overall, and one of their better records, in my opinion. The sophomore full-length album from the Shits, Leeds, England-based six-piece band, is they fuse hardcore punk and noise punk with dark psychedelic rock ideas, and they kind of sling it all together in a way that is menacing and aggressive, and best described as noise rock. And you could find other ways to describe it, but there's a psychedelic, there's a frustrated psychedelia to it, there's a insanity to it, there's a frustration to it that really appealed to me. This was one of my favorite records of the year in general, in terms of maybe something you would not consider metal. Um, and I think this is just a solid band who've really kind of stepped up from their first record, which was pretty good, but not all that notable, to this one, which is clearly just above and beyond in feeling and in register, and the production values are sharp but not too clean. Everything kind of works out for this record on my part, and obviously I connected with it just for how frustrated and fucked up it was. So I appreciate it quite a bit, and you can probably expect to see me talking about it more on my end of the year list. So this album from Elephant Rifle comes after a lot of releases. They've been pretty prolific so far. This is a Reno, Nevada-based quartet, and they kind of mix a little bit of everything. For me, this is not exactly like a Butthole Surfers type band where there's a lot to, every album is a little bit different, and they kind of experiment quickly and move with ideas quickly. It's more that they've added a lot of things to their repertoire over the years, so that every piece is different, and their production values are more layered than most noise rock of this type, and they don't necessarily lean into sludge so much as they do different things that are less predictable. So there's a lot to like about this record. I just thought that it was a little bit inconsistent, and there are a couple songs that are just they're kind of enjoying their experiment too much, and it kind of takes me out of it, where it just feels either less serious or just not fit to put to tape. And I've mentioned the songs along that vein in there. So still worth checking out, and a band that is, I think, making pretty good art in general, but maybe not entirely for my taste through the full listen.
No need to sleep, no need. One know your thirst.
So I think the first thing that was missing from Brussels, Belgium-based noise punk band Sarah's first EP was there just wasn't enough energy to it. I mean, obviously it's it's a punk band in spirit, so obviously there was something there, but Healing Fires just gets it so much more right on this tape. I think there's some psychedelia to it. There's a little bit of a post-punk kind of fucked up wobble to it, but they're just higher speed songs that are shorter, get right to the attack, and they always make kind of an interesting impact. And these folks, they have some interest in extreme metal here and there. It doesn't really show up entirely here outside of creating atmosphere in the recording and some of the different riff styles in their approach, but overall they kind of keep it up in terms of energy, and that's kind of what kept me coming back to this album in general. I thought it really stood out for me, and I was glad that I heard their first EP, and I said, well, I'll just follow them. And from there, I was really impressed by this. I thought it was one of the more interesting records in this style this year. So check that out if you missed it. So I think this year Eugene S. Robinson from Oxbow put out a sort of a memoir or a biography, and there was a lot of really interesting information about the band in it. And it came maybe around the same time as this record, and I missed this record, but I got the book, so it was interesting to have read it and gone back and kind of looked at this kind of modern version of Oxbow, which is very refined. But still kind of nuts, and this everything you like about the band is still there, but they've changed quite a bit from their sort of punk beginnings, and art punk and all that, to now something that is just very, it's not buttoned up at all, but this is probably the best they've ever sounded, and they balance the melodic with the strained, and there's a lot to this record, the way it develops over the full listen. And there's still always an issue with repetition in this type of music. They don't really have a remedy for that because it's such an insistent form, and it relies on over the top expression, and so that becomes a little bit repetitive in the second half, but it's still a strong record, and I would say one of their best over the last several years, and just a little bit better than their 2017 release for my taste. So I believe Common Wounds used to be known as Dead History when they were located in Minnesota, but they've since relocated to Arizona, I believe. I don't know how much of the lineup has changed, if at all, but their sound has changed a little bit. So this is kind of more of a um, 90s heavier grooving noise rock that has some post-hardcore influences, and not necessarily a Helmet style band, but something more late 90s in its approach when we consider the post-hardcore songs that are on here. And if you follow what that means, or maybe I don't know, you obsessed over like Revelation's record catalogs back in the day, you'll understand those distinctions. But really, it means that this is a tuneful, but also a little bit erratic and repetitive EP. It shows that they can do quite a bit with a tuneful song, but also make kind of fucked up hardcore music too. So, interesting EP. I don't know if it really fits my own taste because it's a little bit all the kind of the alt rock side of post hardcore when it gets down to the hook, but it never quite gets to the hook. So decent EP, a good place to restart.
Who can keep saying that's not me? I think you're that much out. Take away all the glamour of your attention. Strip.
So when we're talking about like filthy guitar noise, strained and distraught emotional outbursts, what I consider noise rock in the more traditional sense, or the built from the late 80s sense, you get a bit of that, but also a little bit of the grunge era stuff here too on this record from Miracler. How I Became the Devil is, it's got a little bit of this sludgier, grungy side to it, but it's stripped down to really a baseline of what I would consider maybe an early Unsane production value. But the vocalist is over the top in the way that Steve Austin was more so on the earlier Today Is the Day stuff, like the first two records. So there's this. I describe this record as kind of mania. There's a lot of depression to it. There's a lot of rage to it. There's a lot of different emotions flying around all at once, and it makes for a pretty good noise rock album, a pretty entertaining one that's really knows how to strain every last nerve. You might be 3 songs in and feel like you're done with the album already, but it's a good one to stick with. It's not a bad record. It's a little bit long at 40 minutes, but I think that's substantial enough to where it feels like a serious record and not kind of a throwaway Bandcamp thing. So, yeah. Kircher is a solo noise rock project from a fellow from Prayer Group. You'll probably recognize that band because I liked one of their records a couple of years ago, and we get sort of a different form here. There's a little bit of the psychedelia that people are infusing into noise rock right now. There's a little bit of the kind of a classic of the now kind of sort of noise rock sound to it, but also there's some experiments here, and some of them work and some of them don't. Some of them are pretty strange, but there's always a little bit of an inside joke element to a lot of noise rock, a sort of that's so random aspect to it, and that kind of works here. It is obviously self-recorded, it's a little bit murky, so there's a certain atmosphere to it, which I appreciate. But the more serious songs are what's important here, and there's kind of a lot of filler kind of bumping around in between them. So not entirely honed in, but not a bad result at all for a first go. So Atletica 75 is the first I've heard of Cani Sciori, and apparently they've been out around for quite some time, about 20 years, and this is their ninth full-length album. So this is a noise punk band, and one that doesn't take themselves all too seriously until we get to the musicianship and their performances, which are very high energy. And in particular, the drum performances on this record are fantastic. I think that he just kind of hits it out of the park on every song and dominates the record with just how good of a drummer he is. I couldn't get around that point. The bass is not a huge focus, and the vocalist is pretty over the top too. I compare him to the fellow from Psychic Graveyard, but obviously this guy's, I think, been around a bit longer in this own form. But overall, it's a great sounding record, and I think that the drums kind of sold it to me right away. But the personality of the band was something interesting to be introduced to. I'm kind of curious to go back and check out their other records, and that's a good sign when you're ripping through a bunch of noise rock records. Slow Change Will Pull Us Apart is actually probably more of a post-hardcore record overall. We could call it noise rock for exactly how angular and sort of severe it is in its both its deranged diction and its emotional outbursts throughout. But X Everything are not, they're more of a post-hardcore band overall, and one that have a really strong production value behind this record that really carries it. This is one of my favorite records in this style this year. I wouldn't say it blew me out of the water. It didn't blow my mind, but the first half of it is particularly strong, an introduction to their sound, and the second carries it through. And I would expect that much from people who are members of Kowloon Walled City and Early Graves, pretty quality bands, and I would say this is up to that quality. So if you're a fan of those, you'll probably appreciate the energy, and just the tension they put into this record is amazing. I think it's just heavier than most things in this style you'll hear in recent memory, and there's such a precision to all of it that it can't help but impress. So it's a big recommendation for me if you're interested in this type of music.
Introduced to us.
And finally, we have Intercourse. Halo Castration Institute is the, I believe, third full-length album from Connecticut-based noise rock slash whatever else, kind of sludgier metallic hardcore and band. And they've changed members over the years. There's been a lot of different touches to their style that have changed from album to album. You might remember I was really enthusiastic about the first record. I totally missed their second full length entirely, and now latching onto this one, the huge personality of this band is still there. The Tarek, the guy up front, is still screaming out very loud, and for me, it's a bit much, but I like that about it. I like their speaking their mind in a very loud and almost obnoxious as possible sort of way. And I think that really gets the point across in an entertaining way. You really do have to shout and shake people at the shoulders to get them to hear anything you have to say these days. And I think these guys are doing a good job of it. Um, Not really my taste in terms of aesthetics or whatever else, but it's a pretty entertaining record. And this one didn't give me a headache, so I spun through it at least 4 or 5 times.
Keep wanting to be